We're going to be talking over the next couple of lectures and the next couple of months, in effect, about metabolic dysregulation, which is a big word for says when it ain't working well. And today we're going to spend time on the microbiome, sleep, and how to optimize and how that optimizes health. And we are going to make that part one of two parts. And the second part, which we'll discuss in January, I think it's January 7th, is going to be the brain-gut axis, because that really brings together a lot of the information that's coming out on how the brain and the gut interact, how they talk to each other, the communication that takes place, and how vital that is to our well-being. And what happens when that doesn't work well. And we're going to discuss burnout. And that's going to be in January. But today we're going to be looking at, let me put this on a full screen so that you all can see this, okay? So there we go. So, when you deal with what's called pinnacles of health, and you've all looked at various things, and Reed has given you so much information on understanding wellness. But the definition of health is really ultimately how well connected, fully connected you are to nature. And the human cell needs to be completely connected with what we call unfettered access to information. And so information within the body is incredibly important, and we'll be going over this in the next few minutes. And if that gets severely damaged in whichever way, then a cell will die. It goes through what's called apoptosis. It'll say, I've had it, I'm dying, get rid of me, replace me. And the body is doing this constantly. As we speak, cells are dying and they're being replaced with stem cell replacements, stem cells being in our body specifically for that purpose. Let me just see if I can get this to work. There we go. And so we always begin with a general schematic, which is extremely important because this gives you an idea of where we are. So when you look at the pathogenesis of any kind of chronic inflammatory disease, which is really what makes up the underpinning of so much that we go through in our suffering, inflammatory disease has, as always, a genetic component, a predisposition. We're not going to go over that today, but of course, that is always there in the background. Environmental triggers, extremely important. Everything from the food we eat, the infections and antibiotics, and we're going to go through that more in this hour, and all kinds of toxic products. We live in a sea of 60 or 70,000 chemicals, so there's no question that that plays a big role. The microbiome, that incredible world that's in us, and what happens when it is not functioning properly. How does that affect us? The immune response to all of that. How do we respond to it, and in which way, and how robustly? And is it happening even more robustly than it should? These are all issues that come up. And how does the increase in permeability of the gut, that loss of the barrier and its integrity, how does that eventually lead to the various kinds of clinical outcomes? Resolution of a problem, or chronic inflammatory disease. It just doesn't go away. And that can lead to even a further issue, which is autoimmune disease, which in great part has a chronic inflammatory component. And so we're going to be looking first at the microbiome. And I think right from the get-go, one needs to understand that the gut system starts in the oral cavity and the sinuses. It does not start in the stomach or even the esophagus, but even higher up. The gut starts, in effect, in the nasopharynx. That tube starts in the nasopharynx, where the relationship with the microbiome is actually beginning. And there's a vast microbiome in the nasal cavities and the sinuses. And if you are one of a vast number of people who has nasal or sinus discharge at night, post-nasal drip is what you quite often hear about, that is going to affect what happens. For example, after the age of 40, especially with people with post-nasal drip, the stomach becomes underacidified. So what that means is that there is a translocation of sinus bacteria that are getting down into the area of the stomach and into the intestines, causing SIBO, which is a small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And that can cause, starting with the sinus and the oral cavity, can cause a whole number of conditions, including one which you may not be aware of, but is very well known to people in the pediatric area and so on, and that is called PANDAS. And PANDAS is an acronym for, as you see here, pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorders, which are associated with what? With strep infections. And so the children who are suffering from this become very moody, they are anxious, they become very aggressive, they have all kinds of possible OCD issues, uncontrollable body movements, and good clinicians will tell you that they will start looking at today more and more whether or not there is a bacterial component, which is an important part of that. So what is this microbiome? Let's do a quick overview of that area. And I'm going to tell you that it is an incredible inner ecosystem, this human gut microbiome. Remember that the cells outnumber, in terms of bacterial cells, outnumber the human ones 10 to 1. 10 to 1, even greater than that, actually. And when it comes to genetic information that is in those cells, the total genetic information in genes from bacteria outnumbers humans 150 to 1. There are 3.3 million bacterial genes versus a paltry 25,000 human genes, which we discovered with the Genome Project. Very, very small. There are tiny little animals that have more genes than we have in the human body, but we've got the 3.3 million, and that's extremely important. We now know that in terms of bacterial species, there are over 30,000 and counting. It gets bigger every day. We're just beginning to discover all the bacteria that live there. But that's nothing in comparison to the fungal species, of which it is estimated there are greater than 350,000. And if you want to talk about parasites, protozoa, all of those species, there are hundreds of thousands of those. And we're not even talking about viral species, because if you begin to look at the viruses that live in our body, there are millions. I know we're so involved right now with this novel coronavirus, which is a problem because it's novel, but there are millions of viral species that live within us and are an essential part of our being. In fact, greater than 50% of the colonic content in the colon is bacterial. So when you're pooping, a good part of what you're pooping out is bacteria. Here's some new information. Literally, I just found it today. And every day there's more information. And this is metagenomic analysis reveals the signature of gut microbiota associated with human chronotypes. In other words, what it's really saying is that different bacteria patterns exist in the gut in those who are early risers and late sleepers. In fact, late and early risers have elevated levels of either Alistips, this is a particular type of bacterial grouping, or Lactobacillus. This is a bacterial group, another family of bacteria. So depending on the level of these two particular bacterial groups, and Alistips is very interesting because it is something I didn't know very much about. It is a relatively new genus that we've discovered, and it's implicated in any number of things: liver fibrosis, colorectal cancer, some cardiovascular disease issues, even mood disorders. And in fact, it ferments amino acids for a living in our gut, and it does it through putrefaction. And you remember that because we do a test for indican, which many of you are taking when you're doing our metabolic wellness profile. And so all of this comes together, but that's interesting. So they found that there's a correlation between fatty foods, nocturnal tendencies, and late rising. as well as one between high fiber diets and early rising. So this research, which is in its early stages, is raising the possibility, as they say, and this is a quote, of changing sleep tendencies by altering the microbiome, using probiotics, special molecules, or by changing the diet. And it brings closer the possibility that we can alter the inside of the gut to help people sleep and rise as they want. And this is just today's information, literally hot off the press. So we then have to look at what alterations in gut microbiota can do. And we talked earlier about environmental triggers. Well, there are many. The toxic chemicals, the infections, the dietary proteins and the peptides, and all of that will change things for the microbiota. So it can take you from a eubiotic state, which is a hemostatic state, to a dysbiotic state. And that is going to create a situation where the bacteria, depending on the state they're in, will be interacting with the human host in a different way. So if it's a eubiotic state, a normalized state, there's immune hemostasis. There's a very healthy, stable state. But unfortunately, if there's dysbiosis and it hasn't been taken care of, you can end up with systemic inflammation. What starts in Las Vegas doesn't end in Las Vegas. It may start in the gut. It never ends in the gut. So that will lead to any number of issues, of which I've just put several here: asthma, arthritis, multiple sclerosis, obesity, metabolic syndrome, brain disorders, and the list goes on, by the way. So does that mean that we now can deal with the microbiome and it's going to tell us everything that we need for clinical applicability? The answer to that is unfortunately no. We are just making baby steps. And this comes from some work from Alessio Fasano, a friend and excellent researcher in the area, who said that if you were to look at going from domain all the way to species, you're looking at bacteria as the domain all the way down to the species. If you were to think about it another way, you would say, well, let's look at it as saying that the bacteria represent the universe, and we go from the universe to the Milky Way, all the way through the solar system, etc., through planet Earth, to eventually get to San Diego, where Reed is living. Hi, Reed, if you're on the line. And where are we right now in our understanding? And I would tell you that, as Alessio said, we haven't done anything more than just get to the solar system. We haven't got a clue, really, of what's going on right down to the species level, to the extent that we could, with predictability, use it as a clinical biomarker group. So for those who think that microbiome biomarkers have reached the level in which they can be used predictably, I would say to you, no, that is not the case. But it's coming. It's coming. But what do we know? Well, there are some new paradigms. Number one, and some of you are going to find this quite astonishing, but it's not really. The microbiome is the real center of human health. And in fact, our focus should not be on the human cells necessarily, but it should really be on the microbiome and that whole totality. The analogy being the Galileo revolution. Before Galileo, we thought the Earth was the center of the universe, the human cell. But in fact, no, it's the Earth that is rotating around the proverbial microbiome sun. That's really what's going on. And it's the communication between the two that's really going on. So the microbiome is really the predictor of body health, of hemostasis and disease. And the pathology that you see in human cells is really a symptom. It's not necessarily the cause of the pathogenesis. And so human cell dysfunction can really be looked upon as, in a paradigm, as a lack of communication with the microbiome. Things have broken down in communication. And we know that there are local microbiomes that provide micronutrients to every body organ, not just the intestine. So there are bacteria, protozoa, there are fungi, there are viruses, and they exist all over the body parts. And we know that that is the case. So then what do we know? We know that the microbiome develops very early in life. In fact, it's established by about the age of 3. Some say 2, so we can say 2 to 3. It expands genetic and functional capacity of the human host. Remember, we got 25,000 genes, but in effect, those 25,000 are talking to the 3.3 million constantly. So in childhood, there is the founding of a gut microbial population, and that is what shapes the immune function and disease outcomes for the rest of our life. And in fact, there is a very strong association of early childhood microbial colonization and our health status for the rest of our lives. That's what's so important about early life. And that brings up the issue of antibiotics, because antibiotics can cause rapid and dramatic alterations in this balance, and that can last for months, if not years. And we know that to date, greater than 50% of females are receiving antibiotics during pregnancy, especially when you're having C-sections, and that's even higher in other countries in Asia. We also know that children by the age of 3 have had about 7 to 10 courses of antibiotics that have been administered. And this becomes a problem because we know that antibiotic use is closely paralleling weight and mental health problems. And there are a lot of studies on this, by the way. It goes on and on and on. And none of this is a figment of my imagination. And you'll notice that I have quoted with various references at the bottom of each slide, and there are many more that go with it. And by the way, I will be giving everybody a PDF of this so you don't have to write madly. So in the case of obesity, 50%, there's a 50% rate in children who are given antibiotics in the first 6 months of life, fully 50%. And in the case of mental issues, this is fascinating, very disturbing actually. If you have 1 course of antibiotic in a year, the incidence of depression can increase about 17%. 17%. If you get 2 courses of antibiotics per year, for those people who are susceptible to it, there's an incidence of depression that can increase to approximately 50% or even greater. That's remarkable. And artificial sweeteners and emulsifiers and so on can have a dramatic influence on the microbiome. So it's not just a question of the sugars. There are any number of other things that can cause this. And so you get into the issue of bacterial diversity. And in North America, we have lost it because you know that when you look at animals that are living in the wild, they have a very large diversity splay. So they are very diverse. By the time you get into animals that are in cages in zoos, that very large diversity has already begun to be lost. By the time you get into people living in countries where they are not in major cities, in rural areas, that diversity goes down even more. And when you get to us living in cities, we have lost that diversity completely. And that is a very dangerous issue for us in terms of how we can deal with disease. And so this loss of diverse species and so on is being caused by any number of problems, of which antibiotics is only one of them. Emulsifiers, the sweeteners, the herbicides and pesticides, and I would like to give a complete lecture just on glyphosates. It's a disaster that's like a tsunami that's been coming at us. It's a terrible, terrible issue. And so on. I don't have to go through all of this. And when you take a look at the factors that are affecting gut microflora, I'm not going to go into all of these, but I'm just going to look at a couple that are very important. And I've mentioned this at a number of lectures, but remember the role of breast milk. It's extremely important to be giving breast milk for any number of reasons, and you can see all the things that are there. But one of the things that you see are human milk oligosaccharides that you see here on the bottom. Well, what is that? Well, it turns out that the human, the baby does not actually have the ability to break that down. These HMOs, these oligosaccharides, are there not for the humans, they're prebiotics for commensal intestinal bacteria. It's the commensal bacteria that like them and can eat them and can utilize them in order to generate the short chain fatty acids that are critical for our gut health. So breast milk is producing tremendous amounts of HMOs for the bacteria because we are living in a commensal environment with the bacteria. And so there are a whole number of studies, vast number of studies now, that are all saying effectively the same thing, that an increase in intestinal permeability is associated with gut inflammation. And what is it doing? It's precipitating the development of any number of dysfunctions and diseases, including obesity, fatty liver, which is typical of obese subjects, and type 2 diabetes. And so let's take a look at one of the things about the microbiome and in terms of metabolism, because there's so many things that it's involved in. And so it's involved in fermentation, these short chain fatty acids, as I said, and of course many other things, vitamin synthesis, etc. And so I don't want to burst anyone's bubble, but I think for those who think that probiotics as they're being used today is the answer to all of this, that is not the case. And in fact, in 2018, a very important journal, Cell, which is a very good peer-reviewed journal, brought out two very large articles aside to really deal with this issue. And what it's really saying is that probiotics, as we have now, is not what it may seem, even though it's a multi-tens of billions of dollar business. And what it's saying is that, in this case, it's Smora et al. In one article, says that humans feature a person-specific resistance to gut mucosal colonization by probiotics. So even if you're giving someone probiotics, the gut, in most cases, is resisting it. It will not allow it to settle in properly. And so the conclusion of their study was to say that if you give empiric probiotic supplementation, just sort of an educated guess, just throw a few probiotics in a bottle and send it, that's very limited in universally impacting gut mucosa. So what they're really saying is it merits the development of new personalized probiotic approaches. They're not saying that in the future personalized probiotics won't work. They probably will. But as we are utilizing them now, that's an issue. And the next article that came out right next to it was even more interesting, because it said that if someone has been given antibiotic therapy for whatever reason, and you then give probiotics, given the idea that, oh yes, we want to reestablish a commensal group in the gut, which may have been deranged by antibiotics. In fact, that's not the case, just the opposite. If you give probiotics, it delays gut microbiome and transcriptome reconstitution. It actually takes about 6 months to reconstitute itself. And that's in contrast to what happens if you were to give, and they did this in the study, both in humans and in mice, if you were to give autologous fecal microbe transplants, you give them poop that's been transplanted into the gut, and that will restore very quickly a mucosal microbiome, etc., in about 20 days. And even more interesting, if you just were to give a placebo, just placebo, that'll take about 30 days, which is way, way less time than with the probiotic. So probiotics may not be in and of themselves what they seem. Is it bad? No, but you need to understand the effect that they have and maybe think more in terms of prebiotics than necessarily probiotics. So the conclusion of that study with the antibiotics was to say that probiotics perturb rather than aid in the recovery of microbiota back to whatever baseline they had after antibiotic treatment. So that was a real eye-opener and should be an eye-opener for others. But the microbiome is incredibly important. In fact, we know that when it comes to dealing with the breakdown of polysaccharides and so on that enter the gut, we now know, it's very established, that the microbiota is essential for digestive function. That's for sure. But what about those antibiotics? Well, we know about 80% of what's sold in the US, and it's not that far off in Canada where I am, is for animal production. And the reasons have been very straightforward, right? You have two reasons. You decrease gastrointestinal infection in the cows, and you increase the weight of the animals. And to this day, ladies and gentlemen, about 50% of beef and poultry are still given antibiotics in very high amounts. In fact, the 2020 estimate is about 35 million pounds, and you're reading that right, is utilized in meat and poultry production. What happens to it? Well, it goes into manure as a fertilizer and ends up increasing in the soil and in the plants, and eventually then is increased in our food content. And if you add that to what we are also being given directly as humans to treat human disease with antibiotics, which is also quite substantial, about 8 million pounds, then that together is a recipe for some real problems. So the situation today is that there's an increased risk of allergies and food sensitivities, especially if antibiotics are used in the first 2-3 years of life. And as I said earlier, there are about 7 or 10 regimes of antibiotics that are given. So that's quite a substantial issue. And that can adversely program the body's systems for the remainder of our life, especially the immune system. So this is not a small issue. So I'm not going to go into this one right now. I'm going to go into sleep and melatonin and circadian rhythm, because that's what you were waiting to hear about. Well, let's talk about circadian rhythm for a few moments. Circadian rhythm, another way of putting that, is our 24-hour clock, is something that we know a fair bit about. We do understand that in the case of any number of hormones, including melatonin in the brain starts its secretion just before we go to sleep and then becomes very, very high as we sleep and then stops just before we get up, etc., and then is very low during the day. There's an internal clock that we have, and it has various cues. Bright light, food, all of that is sending signals to any number of the body parts, but definitely to the brain's suprachiasmatic nucleus. That's where the pineal gland is sitting, and that is what produces melatonin, and that synchronizes the peripheral circadian clocks, which are all using melatonin. Now, just remember what that means, that there are clocks, there's a circadian rhythm in the brain, but there are also circadian rhythms throughout the body, and they need to be able to communicate with each other. So we do know that circadian rhythms are influencing any number of things: appetite, nutrient absorption, metabolism, and if that gets disrupted, it's going to make you much more vulnerable to a whole number of digestive disorders, let alone anything else, and that includes classic reflux, GERD, ulcers, IBD, IBS, even gastrointestinal cancer. So that's a circadian rhythm, but what about sleep cycles? Well, this has been known for a long time, that we go through 4 or 5 cycles in an average 8-hour sleep period, and that 8 hours is important. You can't do it with 3 hours, so to speak, because during that time you go through these cycles where you have about 25% of the time is with REM sleep, that's rapid eye movement sleep, which can go up to about 50% in infants, and that REM sleep is increasing with each cycle. And it's extremely important because things are taking place in being able to regenerate parts of the body parts during that time. The rest of the time, which is about 75% of the total sleep time, is in the rest of it, the stage 2, 3, and 4 stage of sleep. And as I said, there are 4 or 5 of these cycles, and the first 2 cycles are longer and deeper, and that's when, just at the end of the second cycle normally, is when you get the highest level of melatonin. And so there are a whole number of body functions that are influenced by sleep stage. What stage are you in the sleep cycling? And that can be improved by adjusting what factors are there that are influencing sleep. And then there are other issues that are influenced not so much by sleep stage, but they're influenced by circadian rhythm. And let's take as an example digestion. If you're looking at the effects of circadian and sleep stages, we know that sleep stage is going to influence, for the most part, motility of the esophageal and swallowing, of the gastric area, intestinal area, colonic motility. So mostly it's the movement of the muscles, allowing them to move stuff through the gut. Well, this is different from the circadian influence, which is really influencing things like secretion, the kind of secretion, the amount, especially in the stomach, and absorption in the intestinal area, both the small and large intestine, not so much motility. So if you have the effects of insufficient sleep, if you have sleep deprivation, that is going to cause any number of these things to happen. And it's important. You can impair the immune system. You're going to increase inflammation. You are going to destabilize glucose metabolism, which is incredibly important, by, in many ways, increasing insulin resistance. The issue of appetite and obesity we touched upon before, as well as diabetes. One of the things that we didn't talk about as much is an increase in anxiety and depression, and much of that is the inability of the brain especially, and the gut, to produce the hormones that are needed, specifically those like serotonin and dopamine, which are produced in the gut, 70-80% of them in the gut, to produce it properly in a circadian pattern. And remember our favorites, cortisol and melatonin. We know that with cortisol, it reaches its highest level just in the morning, and then it has a diurnal move through the day. It decreases until it gets to its lowest level in the evening. Melatonin, on the other hand, it reaches its highest stage in the middle of the night, somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning. By the time we wake up, it has decreased to almost its lowest level, and then maintains an extremely low level for the time during the day, and then starts to slowly go up in the evening. Remember, though, that melatonin can be disrupted and increase its amount if there is excessive dysbiotic behavior, or if your circadian rhythm gets, in effect, screwed up, and you can begin to see higher levels of melatonin. And so we really need to know, what is it about this particular hormone? Well, melatonin is produced by tryptophan. And for those of you who forgot, tryptophan is an amino acid that is produced mostly by bacteria in the gut. There we go again. And what does tryptophan do? Well, it produces serotonin, for one, which is extremely important in the brain, let alone in our gut area. But it can also create melatonin either through serotonin or directly from tryptophan. And I have put this as the first thing. We know that melatonin is important for sleep, But a lot of research will say to you, they'll say that what they find is it has probably an even more important function as an antioxidant. And in fact, it is one of the most important antioxidants that we have in our body because it protects mitochondrial protection. It scavenges free radicals. It upregulates glutathione, which, as you know, is the poster child for what we need to keep our mitochondria and our cell hemostatic. And if you don't do that, it's going to break down. And of course, it's important for circadian rhythm, for sleep, of course, and to regulate GI motility, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. It is important in the chelation of metals and even in neuroprotection, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. For those who do not have enough melatonin, or if it's not functioning properly, they will get age-related neurogenic diseases. It has a role to play in male fertility, as well as we know, in blood sugars, because it is going to be related to a decrease in blood sugar. So bottom line, good circadian rhythm will create a decrease in oxidative stress, a la this whole issue of antioxidants. But if you're getting sleep disruption, it's known medically as chrono disruption, that causes an increase in reactive oxygen species and nitrogen species. And this was something that comes from a 2018 article. Those who've taken Reed's lectures will know that he has looked at this as well. This is a very, very good review article which looks at melatonin, its anti-inflammatory protection of gastric function. And one of the things that it talks about is the fact that melatonin is not only in the gut, is not only affected by a downward influence from the brain, but it works within the gut itself. And what it does is any number of things, increasing free radical scavenging. Remember I mentioned antioxidant. It creates a uptick in all of those things that do cause vasodilation, which allows for better blood flow through the mucosa so that you can get better digestion. The growth factors like ghrelin and gastrin and any number of other proteins like this, which will increase mucosal growth and repair, and it does downregulate or decreases pro-inflammatory cytokines, such as tissue necrosing factor alpha. And melatonin then will get circulated from the gut back into the hepatic or the enterohepatic loop, and doesn't enter into the general circulation, but stays within that area. So let's then try to summarize what we know about melatonin. We know it's released in the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the pineal gland, which is in the brain, and it does that in circadian fashion. So in response to a dark environment, it's promoting sleep. But it's produced as well in circadian fashion by neuroendocrine cells of the stomach and the duodenal mucosa and the colon, in other words, in the gut. And the amount of melatonin in the gut is 10 to 100 times more than in the blood, but it stays in the gut mucosa and in that enterohepatic loop. But there's at least 400 times more melatonin in the gut tract than there is in the pineal gland. So one could say it plays a big role in gut function. It helps to synchronize the clock so that you get food intake in the right way, and myoelectric rhythms, the motility I was talking about earlier. And it inhibits gastric acid release and increases that flow, the blood flow that I told you about in the gut area. And if you have less melatonin that's released, you'll get more gastric ulcers, and they'll take longer to heal, etc. I'm not going to go through that in detail. So if you want to stimulate melatonin, you need that dark environment prior to sleeping, decrease blue light, stop looking at your phone just before you go to sleep, avoid eating. These are clearly things we all know. Try to avoid watching TV. That's also more blue light before bedtime. Decrease a high carb diet. It stands to reason. It's going to lower the blood glucose. We all know that. Do we do it? Maybe not, but we know. And there are a whole number of foods that will increase the levels of tryptophan and melatonin, and you can look at that when you look at the PDF. So we know that sleep is essential for metabolic health. And here's more new information. You want to know how it really works? Well, during waking hours, our body is constantly under various types of stress. And so we know that there is constant neuronal DNA damage that's occurring. That's part of life. That's what's going on. And that is part of what triggers sleep. In other words, sleep is needed by the body to repair the damage. There's no other way around it. So during sleep, it increases the DNA repair by any number of different structures that do the DNA repair. And so in that way, it reduces the pressure on the cell itself. It allows it to stay in hemostatic balance. And if you have sleep deprivation, it's increasing the activity of a particular detector called PARP1, and this is very recent information. PARP1 is in fact a detector that is saying, hey, there's a lot more damage, bring in the troops that are going to do the repair. So that PARP1 activity is really what's going to be able to promote even more sleep, allowing more damage repair. And that may explain the link between sleep disturbance, aging, and neurodegenerative disorders like Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease. It's not the only thing, but it's clearly an important part of the story. And so now we know that sleep and the microbiome is a two-way street. The microbiota affect how we sleep. We know that. But sleep and the circadian rhythm is affecting the microbiota. It's affecting microbial diversity, and in that way, our overall health. And that's part of the gut-brain axis, which we're going to discuss next time in great detail. But if you just have 2 nights, let me just mention this. If you have just 2 nights of insufficient or disrupted sleep, research is clearly showing, there are many of these studies, rapid negative effects on the microbiome health, a significant decrease in the commensal bacterial species, those are the good bacteria, so to speak, and an increase in the species that are linked specifically to obesity and type 2 diabetes. This we know. This is not something we're thinking about. We know this. There's also a significant decrease in insulin sensitivity, which is part of the whole dynamic of type 2 diabetes. So I'm going to let you read about diabetes in the PDF. I just gave you this information because it's important for you to know that. So if there's lack of sleep, how does that affect gut health? Well, it increases stress. There's a rise in cortisol levels, that's for sure. So it increases intestinal permeability, bloating, inflammation, stomach pains, food sensitivities, and gut microbiome changes. So dietary choices are important. When you're sleep deprived, what happens? You get increased appetite. Due to what? Due to the hormone ghrelin, which if you're not sleeping, it's going to be increasing its stimulation, and that's going to give you more appetite, and you're going to keep eating. Melatonin decrease is very important in increasing reflux. We know that. That's an established fact. And so it's important to know. So one of the things that you should be doing, try not to eat within 3 hours of bedtime. I know we all talk about it, but this is now becoming a very important issue which has objective aspects related to it. Another study, the microbiome and cognitive function. The results showed gut microbiome composition is a possible mechanism linking inadequate sleep to poor neurocognitive outcomes. And their conclusion is quite stark. In the ages from 50 to 85, there's a strong connection between higher sleep quality and resulting higher levels of beneficial gut microbiome, microbes, just like I said a moment ago, and better cognitive flexibility. So here's the question. Could the effects of poor sleep on gut bacteria contribute to cognitive decline in older adults? There's a question. Could a healthy gut help protect against the impact of poor sleep on cognitive health? These are important questions which they ask. So in terms of then health optimization, which is what we're going to finish with, I mentioned at a previous lecture the evolution of the diet, which up until about 10,000 years ago was really fruits and tubers and nuts and meat. And it's just changed in literally the last heartbeat, so to speak. And with the diet and the microbiome, we talked about diversity, that there's much less in primates and definitely much less in modern societies, which is leading invariably to autoimmune disease. And the lowest diversity in bacteria is in Western postmodern societies. And we know that it's been low in all humans because as we went from nomadic to sedentary life, gluten became more prevalent. We started cooking foods which decreased the need for bacterial breakdown of plant food fibers, so a lot less fiber in general, and the increase in antibiotics. And so we all in modern society have suboptimal gut communities in our guts. We have about a third of the diversity in North America than many of the tribes in African societies have in their guts. Fully 1/3 less. And we're not even discussing the effects of pesticides. So how do you improve the microbial environment? Number one, increase fermented food content in the diet. That's even more than dietary fiber. Both of them are important. And if you're, excuse me, and if you're talking about probiotics, they can give a transient improvement. I'm just going to stop for one moment. But their effect is gone after 24 or 48 hours. So what you really need is fermented food and dietary fiber. I'm just going to hold on for one moment, please.
Amber, have you been taking as many notes as I've been taking? This is blowing my mind.
Yes, so much excellent information.
Yes, I've got a lot of questions.
So I'm just going to tell you, just before I finish, I'm just going to say to you that in the PDF, because I'm going to try to finish it right now, in the PDF, there's going to be the effect of fasting, which I can discuss the next time around, especially the issue of the what's called 618 or 18:6, and the effect of what's called the dawn phenomenon, which we'll discuss next time around. Let me literally finish with this. This is the importance of the first 2 to 3 years in driving chronic inflammatory disease and autoimmune epidemic. This is one of the most important slides. What's going to determine what you're going to have in the rest of your life is what happened in the first 2-3 years. Was there a vaginal delivery? Was there proper nutrition? Did you have low infections in the first 2-3 years, remember? And were there very low or almost no antibiotics given? That's going to affect the microbiome composition because it's going to lead to a balanced microbiome. Whereas if you had a C-section, if there was improper nutrition, if there are multiple infections, multiple antibiotic treatments, that's going to lead in most cases to some form of dysbiosis later in life. In the case of a balanced microbiome, that leads to a high threshold of the gut-associated lymphoid tissue. In other words, the immune system isn't going to shoot off at just about anything that enters, it has a high barrier to entry. It's there just to deal with things like major infections and so on. And if you have a possibility of a good genetic predisposition, you're fine. You're one of the lucky ones. You end up with a normal response to antigens and you have a good state of health. But if in fact there's been inappropriate or a low threshold for GALT, the immune system is shooting off to almost everything, then that is going to invariably lead to all kinds of pro-inflammatory cytokines stimulating the body in many ways, which is going to cause all forms of chronic disease and epidemics. And so if you're doing prebiotics or probiotics or synbiotics, which is the combination of pre and pro, and as I said to you, I believe much more strongly in prebiotics, in fermented foods, in fibers, that is going to lead to a balanced microbiome composition and healthy cells. Whereas if you don't get that, it's going to lead more really to dysbiotic behavior. And that is the end of this wonderful story for today. And I am ready, if all of you can take a breath, ask me whatever you'd like.